what is your intention? Is your intention to just like get them to be so interested in what you're doing and buy right away? Like, are you just trying to like get to a sale or get to some type of like great outcome for yourself? Or is your intention to actually have a conversation and connect with them and deepen the relationship from the beginning so that that just becomes the obvious choice if there is something you can solve for them?
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Slow Smoke Business Podcast. I'm your host, Jarrod Morgan, and we're going to have a good one today, folks. We're doing pork belly burnt ends. Look at this. I got 2 trays. It's football season, finally. We're watching football at my house tonight, so I'm making way too much food. And we're joined by Talia, Jacqueline, a communication expert, the CEO of Visceral, TED Talker. Is that a thing? TED Talker? You're a TED Talker?
I mean,
I guess so.
It's TEDx. I gotta demote myself a little
Oh,
bit.
come on.
TED.
Still TED.
It's
not
TED.
like it's not FredX. It's TEDx. It's
Exactly.
still there. Talia talks a ton about communication, and I love your perspective on it. And so as we get this on the grill, you're actually calling in from Texas. So this
Yes.
podcast has probably got to feel like a home game for you,
It
right?
does. I thought you guys were based here because of the name and the concept. So yes.
I don't think anyone said anything nicer to me than mistaking me for a Texas barbecue podcast. We are actually barbecuing early in the morning because burnt ends take a long time. I'm going to kind of really do them slow this time. So I've got these. These are pork belly pieces that I've cubed up, frankly, in probably 2 big cubes. But we've got them on a little tray here that we could just move them easily. Covered them in my favorite pecan sugar rub, which is one of my favorite things. And we're going to do them at 250 for really an indeterminate amount of time until they start to get like probe tender. Then we're going to take them off. We're going to put them in a tray, coat them with some barbecue, and then we're going to candy them up, and they're going to be delicious. And we're going to watch football tonight, which I am fired up about. So, Talia, let's talk communication. You are you have a really unique perspective on the way that businesses should communicate. And so I want to dive right into something that you said during your TED Talk, which was, you talked about ditching the pitch, right?
Yes.
And getting away from the kitschy, what's your why, and all that other stuff. What do you think is the better way to communicate what you or your business does?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, this is such a big question because I think it's something that so many people struggle with, whether you're a business owner, you're a professional in any field. So really at the core of it, it's first what not to do. So in my very strong opinion, understanding a lot of business psychology, like most people share their titles or a label and they immediately put themselves in a box. You tell people you're a insurance agent or you're an attorney or you're in the financial advising or services industry, and you immediately get like pigeonholed and put in a box of everyone that they've ever met that sounds remotely like you. And so at the core of it, it's actually not obsessing over the words that you use to describe what you do and making sure that you punch that answer with the right emotion. And it becomes this conversation starter. And in the talk, I talk a lot about the emotion of anger, which a lot of us don't realize is so powerful in business. And so that we can unpack that if we want to. But I think that when you lead with a really strong emotion, and it's funny because I really think that, Jarrod, we all know that we have to use emotions in business. We are, that message is like regurgitated and
Sure.
like drilled into us, but I don't know if a lot of people show you how to. And so that was something that I really wanted to make a really key part of what we do.
So you said anger. I mean, so does it go like, hey, I'm Talia. Hey, I'm Jarrod. And Talia says, well, what do you do? And I said, let me tell you something. I'm pissed off. That's what I do. And I stay pissed.
I'm pissed off. People don't barbecue enough.
People are out here grilling vegetables. No, but I mean, I've heard some of your examples before, and you talk about emotion, and anger is an emotion.
Yeah.
And what was so cool about the things that I've heard you talk about is this is actually, I try to think of myself as somebody who likes communication and tries to get good at it. But the question that you talk a lot about when someone asks me, what I do. Like last week I was at church and I met somebody new, nice guy, and he said, "What do you do?" I never know how to answer that question because
Yeah.
I just don't, it's no answer is just hits the mark where, especially if you're not trying to get into a huge, like the guy's just asking because he's just wanting to know what end of the spectrum am I on? Am I digging ditches? Am I putting rockets in space? Like, where am I at? Right. And so, I don't know. I've run a couple businesses. I just never know where to go with it.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting is, I think that most people don't answer in a very conversational way. Like all of a sudden when you get asked that question, you either go into like you put the business hat on and you give them like your elevator pitch, which is the whole point of ditch the pitch. And then they're like, okay, thank you for letting me know. And they move on.
Right.
Instead of making it like a conversation starter. So think about how we actually converse casually. As we're talking, I just said it. I was like, so think about how we converse casually. When someone asks you what you do, I feel like it's so ingrained to just immediately jump into the pitch or not feel like you know how to squeeze in all of the value that you bring to the world in like 2 sentences. And there's this immediate pressure that gets built of like, I don't know what to say and I don't know how to say it and I don't know if that's enough. But really, if we can make it more conversational and somebody asks you, hey, Jarrod, what do you do? And you go, so, you know how there are a lot of podcasts out there and a lot of them are real good at like teaching you things. It's informational. It's a lot of audio, whatever. But no one's doing, something that also engages you visually. So we grill barbecue while we talk business.
I love it. Let's hey, Alex, record that. We're going to put that on.
That's super like
we're going to put that on the teaser. No.
That's improvise on the spot. I don't even think that that's that good.
No, it's true. I think you're getting to the point of like and you didn't just do and I love Simon Sinek, by the way, but I think anytime somebody like him really catches on in sort of pop culture, people do try, instead of taking the spirit of what he's saying when he says find your why, they try to do Simon Sinek impressions sometimes. Let me tell you my why, right? And it's just
so that it's uncomfortable.
Yeah,
that's not natural. It's not natural.
It's not.
So to kind of go back and kind of reverse back into the answer that I gave, I think that it's all about communicating in a natural, conversational way where people are actually interested in what you say, because you're talking as we're talking right now. And someone says, hey, what do you do? So there are 2 things that I'll use as like what I would call a pattern interrupt in psychology. I didn't name that. It's a phrase in NLP. And the pattern
hold on. For the uninitiated, what's NLP?
Yes. NLP is neuro-linguistic programming, and it's a very interesting I would just say segment or modality in psychology that is where a lot of persuasive communication comes from. And it's the root of a lot of what I have learned in communication in general and how the mind works. It's basically how people process your language and how they create some type of representation of that in their minds. So within that world of psychology, something called a pattern interrupt is where we are constantly living in patterns. I mean, the very nature of an elevator pitch and the what do you do question is a pattern, just like when someone says, how are you? I'm good. How are you? That's a pattern in our society that we default to, for better or for worse, instead of actually getting into a really deep conversation. So the pattern interrupt around the what do you do question has to be some type of transition where you don't jump into the pitch right away because that's what you're accustomed to doing. You say something like, well, here's what really pisses me off in business. Or, well, here's what pains me that I just can't stand, and here's what we're doing about it.
So what I notice about everything you say is every example you've given, there's like a transitional word. And I love that you called it a pattern interrupt, because that's such a good way to frame it, and it makes me understand it a little bit better. Because I we've all done the thing where someone passes you in a hallway and they say something like, they don't say how you doing today. They say something like, good to see you. And you say, fine, right? Because it's just you had the pattern expectation, and there was like the social contract that I'm going to say something to you.
It's a social contract we don't even know that we sign.
That's right. And I love the idea of a pattern interrupt, because when I think about marketing communication, I'm going through this right now with one of our companies. We do painting and concrete
Hmm.
coatings. We have a company here that does a lot of that, and we're working on a lot
Oh,
of our
cool.
marketing. And one of the things that with every organization that we work with, we're talking about whether a Google ad campaign is effective, and then I'll get a comment like, well, we really don't have an offer. If you had something
Hmm.
like a 30% off thing, and I'm like, is that really what's motivating people? Like,
Yeah.
or is it because they hate the way their concrete looks and they want us to make it pretty?
Yeah, it's
Like
probably the latter.
it's probably the latter, right? And so, does the 30% really get you to pick up the phone? Like, I don't know. It just feels like that's 1980s. Call now. Operators are standing by. Like hokey, fake things like that. I think in today communication that resonates with people comes off as more authentic and real. And if you don't come off as
Yeah.
authentic as real, the best you can hope for is like a transactional kind of
Yeah.
engagement.
I agree with you. I think that a lot of the times it is transactional in nature, but that is the question that I would throw back to how do you answer the what do you do question, Jared? It's what is your intention? Is your intention to just like get them to be so interested in what you're doing and buy right away? Like are you just trying to like get to a sale or get to some type of like great outcome for yourself? Or is your intention to actually have a conversation and connect with them and deepen the relationship from the beginning so that that just becomes the obvious choice if there is something you can solve for them?
Yeah, I guess it just depends on whether it's a casual conversation, like the guy I bumped into at church that was a nice guy that
Yeah.
honestly, like, the only outcome I really wanted out of that exchange was that he didn't think I was some stiff. You know what I mean? Like I was some,
Yeah.
like, hey man, easy to, let's talk kind of thing rather than when you ask somebody, what do you do? I'm a lawyer, right? Or dental, I work for a dental, whatever, right? I mean, it's so much more fun to say, I don't know, but it's sort of like it's hardwired in the brain to think that you're required to answer with a stat from your bio. Like, what do you do? My current title is vice, it just isn't
CEO at
right.
Visceral.
Is that really important? And I've also, by the way, entrepreneurship pet peeve here. I, when somebody has a very small company, I think you have to use the I'm the CEO spiel so sparingly because to me, I think there's I don't know. It's like when people say, I'm the CEO of some little company, like who cares, frankly, especially when your company is two people big, right? So you just crowned yourself. What really is important, so you will not see on any of my cards or any of my bylines um, CEO, despite the fact that I'm essentially the CEO, but they're not super big businesses yet. Now, the company that I started, Procter U, that got to be really big and venture backed and all that other stuff, like, yeah, of course you have a corporate title and everything else. But when you're in the startup thing, when people ask you about your business, especially if you're a one man band, I feel like it's so much more effective to just say, hey, I started this company called whatever, and you know what we do? We help people, blah, blah, blah. And it's sort of, I guess it's just a different sort of play off of what you're saying. But I've noticed that when you see people that are clearly have absolutely nothing going for their business, right? They're always big to call themselves, I am the president and CEO of some company that is about to go out of business and has never made a dollar.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think that how we identify with the work that we do is also different and personal to us. I think that it's motivated by different things. I think in some instances it's masking some type of insecurity. In some instances you look at your company as an extension of you and therefore you identify in a more kind of personal way with it. I really think that for everyone it's a little bit different, but I get your point and I think that that's a fair point to make. I mean, there's a difference between being like the CEO of Facebook and the CEO of a one woman show or a one man show. So I get your perspective on that. But I also think it's how we identify with the work that we do that leads to the titles we choose.
So I think when you introduce yourself as CEO of Visceral, I think there's there's a competence that you're sort of communicating by giving that title. But I think I can picture in my head the type of entrepreneur I'm talking about, and I don't know how to describe them, but it's these ones where they've started something and you find them more at, startup conferences than they are where their customers are. They're like handing out their business cards. They got the snarky t-shirt with the blazer on.
Yeah, I understand what you're talking about.
It's a trap that a lot of startup folks fall into, particularly males, right? So it's like the startup bro culture is, where you're running around, we're crushing it, and we're this.
Well, I agree. I think there's a difference between like having a business and building a business. I think there's a huge difference between that. Like anyone can have a side hustle or have some type of business, but I think that the act of building it maybe changes what you're backing into, what you're getting at.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. First of all, it's hard to get started. And so my hat's off, even if you do some of the schmucky things that I'm like picking at right here, like my hat's off to anybody that steps in the ring and tries to build a business. I think it makes the country better. I think it makes communities better. I think it makes lives better, creates opportunities for other people. But it's hard to go from starting to, growing to thriving to, all those things take constant, it's like a garden that you have to tend to and pull the weeds and water and stuff like that. But I think people get, one of the things that hampers people from getting started is the ability to communicate the way that you're talking about. I had a guy a week ago came and said, "Hey, I've got this business idea. I want you to tell me what you think." And he walks me through what is objectively a great concept. And what I talk about all the time is it can't just be a good idea. You have to be positioned to execute on it, right? I mean, you and I can just, you know what? We're gonna cure brain cancer. Well, are either one of us positioned to do that? No. It's a good idea, but we're not positioned. This guy had a good idea. He had a good element of positioning that he could be the guy to do it, but he struggled so much explaining what this thing did because he was a product guy and he was an operational guy, and he felt like he had to tell you every button and every knob and what every button and everything. And I was like, when he got done, I was like, brother, you have to figure out in a couple of sentences, what does this do for people? And you have to start with that, right?
Yeah, it's good advice. I love what you said like a few points ago on the you have to be positioned to solve the problem that you actually are choosing to build a business around. I read something a couple months ago, or somebody, I forget if I read it or if somebody told me. I think it was probably my partner Max who told me about the concept of founder problem fit. Like there's product market fit, and then there's founder problem fit.
I've never heard that before. That's really good.
Founder that is positioned to solve that problem. And I loved that because I think that is so key. You have to be it,
Yeah, I mean, before we started ProctorU, which we had a lot of success with and grew and did a lot of great stuff for the industry, the ed tech industry, the same two guys, me and Matthew J., who's been on the show a bunch of times, we started a real estate company that was essentially a Zillow, right? It was before there was a Zillow, right before Zillow came out. And when Zillow came out, the gig was over. But the point was we were not positioned at all to execute on what was objectively a good idea. Like the concept of a Zillow and a Trulia is a great idea, but we were not the dudes to do it, right? And then right after that, we get this quirky, what if we watch people take tests via webcam? And that was a huge success because I was working at a university at the time. I had the contacts, I had the context, and I think that's when people tell me they want to get into entrepreneurship, one of the things I always tell them is stop trying to find a product or build a business and go find a problem to solve, right? And if you start with the problem, because the problem is if you start with a product, then you're gonna be so incentivized to say, well, the thing that I've already sunk all this effort into has to be the solution, right? Because if it isn't, well, what am I going to do? And I think that's if you start with a problem and you can communicate that problem and communicate the solution, you're going to be way ahead of what's second.
I agree with you. And I really want to expand on that point because it's something that we talk a lot about in our trainings, especially in the world of like marketing and branding. Everyone's trying to like find the problem that they solve. And I think that without that, like you said, you're talking about the product. You're not talking to the person about a problem that they have. But one of the things that I find really interesting, and it's part of really where my passion is with Visceral, is most people, Jarrod, will like pick a problem out of a hat. Like there's this very intellectualized way of like mentally coming up with a problem that they can solve and then mentally, logically coming up with a strategy around that and how to build something around it. And I really, really believe that the founder problem fit actually comes from how you emotionally select the problem. And then like truly use what moves you, what pains you, what pisses you off. There's so many more emotions that I'll use as like an anchor for people to identify the problem that they solve. If it isn't coming from that place, you can't communicate it from a powerful place. You're communicating an idea. You're not communicating something that you stand for above anything else that people hear and they're like, mic drop. Like, that's so interesting. Tell me more. And that's the point.
That's such a good way to think about it too. Yeah, because when you say that, it reminds me of when I try to think about the moments in my career where I was getting a project off the ground, and like with the ProctorU thing, I don't think I was super passionate about the problem of keeping people from cheating on tests. I make that joke all the time. It's like the nerdiest thing, and like, who's that guy that's doing that? But I created this little thing just to solve a problem that I saw. But I think when I got angry was when I had lots of people in the education industry that were telling me that you can't do that, but they could never articulate why. They just were like, okay, you can't do that. And I said, well, why? Why? What do you mean? Well, it's just better if you watch them in person. And I was like, well, what's happening when you watch someone take a test in person versus online? What's the difference? And they would go, well, it's just, you can see what they're doing. I could see what they're doing. And then I got angry that people were taking what I thought was progress that opened up doors for people and allowed them to do, test anywhere and everything else. They were shutting that down simply because they didn't have the motivation to really think through what correct was. Does that make sense? I mean, I find, and then, but so the anger didn't really come until like a step or two into the process.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the times, I would say most of us start a business because we're angry about something or because we see something that isn't right and we want to fix it and do something about it. But then once the business starts kind of getting off the ground running, all these other emotions like stress and overwhelm and how do we like make it, how do we monetize, come into the picture. And that actually comes out in your communication. It affects the strength of your communication. And then later on, a lot of the times I'll work with companies that are already established and they're firms that have been around for a long time, or they're some startups, but for the most part, they're companies that have been around for a while. And I have to reconnect them to the anger that they have and the anger that they had when they first started, as long as it's still relevant, so that they can actually communicate in a strong way.
So I was holding this in my back pocket, but I really want to get your take on a story that you told in your TED Talk, which was about, I think it touches on, we've talked a lot about emotion and communications.
Yeah.
And it touches on one of the most famous speeches of all time.
Yes.
And where the line came from. So Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. You talk about how, I mean, we're talking about what, as I heard you talk about this, I thought to myself, is there a more impactful speech in the 20th century? And I really can't think of one, right?
I honestly can't either.
I think it's probably the greatest speech in a century of oratory history, right?
Agreed.
And yet, you talk about the fact that what made that so memorable, what made that one of the most famous speeches of all time, was not even in the speech originally. So Can you talk about that a little bit and tell me how did that come about? Where did that line from that speech come from, and how does it relate to all this? Oh yeah,
absolutely. Oh my gosh, it's so I recently actually learned this about a year ago, and it was when I first learned this story, I was like, I cried. And it's because communication is everything to me. I think that everything that we do is shaped by the way people process what we say. and the relationships we build and the businesses that we build and all of that. And so the story is around Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who most people do not know that, and I did not know, that his entire I Have a Dream section of his speech was improvised. It was never even supposed to happen.
That's so wild.
And it's actually, if you really want to learn the behind the scenes story, there's a book called Behind the Dream by Clarence Jones, who was one of his speechwriters. And he tells the story that from his vantage point, where he was standing that day, and with the backstory that he had and who he was to Martin Luther King, he saw it all happen. And so it is a brilliant book. I really loved hearing it from his perspective. But the story is this. Dr. King was working on an I Have a Dream concept. And he was obviously a preacher, and he would, give his sermons in church. And he was working on some type of speech that included an I Have a Dream statement. It was nowhere near what he had delivered that day, but it was an idea that he had. And he had a really close friend, Mahalia Jackson, who was a gospel singer that in the book that Clarence Jones writes, he talks about how she was like his confidant. When he had moments of doubt and when he needed, support, she was there for him. And they had a really beautiful friendship in that way. She was a singer. Of course, she was very poetic and connected to song. And anyway, so they had this beautiful friendship. And there was a lot that went into even making the march happen that day. Like, we don't even think about, and I think we learned at some point in our American history classes that, it was obviously a lot of effort. It was during a very shaky time, and having a huge mob of people wasn't technically safe. And so they actually had to overcome like a lot of pushback from the government and the president to be able to have the march that day. So there was a lot of focus on that and not as much focus on his speech. And the night before, he asked his speechwriters to deliver to him what they were recommending he said that day. And Steve Jones gave him a speech, and it didn't even have the I Have a Dream section in it.
Oh my gosh.
And the day of, he gives the speech. And if you go back and listen, Jarrod, if you watch the whole thing, you literally see him looking down at his script, and you see him reading from what he had prepared. And he's Dr. Martin Luther King. Like, people are cheering and going crazy, and it's still so powerful because of, I think, who he was. And then this crazy moment happens about 12 minutes into the speech. The speech is 17 minutes long. 12 minutes in, or about that time, right when it was about to end, Mahalia Jackson was sitting a couple feet in front of him, and she yells up at him, "Tell them about the dream." And he puts it aside, he pushes the script to the side, and he just goes off, and he riffs, and he literally delivers one of the greatest speeches of all time. And it's remembered. It wasn't even called the I Have a Dream speech.
The fact that it wasn't called the I Have a Dream speech, the fact that it was ad-libbed, and the fact what you're saying is such a powerful story because there's so many little lessons in there, right? So here's a guy who believes so much in his cause. He's about to give the most important speech of his life, and the night before, he's asking people, what should I say? So here's a person that knows and believes in his cause so much that he doesn't necessarily need a fully written out speech because he can do it from the heart.
It comes so from the heart. And when I learned this, it actually was, it was exactly the point I was trying to make, which is why I use this story. I don't think it just came from the heart. This was personal to him. This came from an anger around something that was unjust. And that anger got communicated with passion. And everything came to life after that. And I think it's really, really important to actually connect that dot. It wasn't just who he was. His speech, his ability to communicate so powerfully came from a very deep place. And I think that has actually gotten lost in business.
Don't we all need a person in our tribe sitting 2 rows ahead of us or whatever?
Right.
Poking us to go, do the thing, man.
Right?
It's so...
And it's really another interesting twist on that is without her, would the speech have happened?
How would we remember that march, right? I mean, or would we? I mean, look, there were lots of marches going on, right? I mean, that
Absolutely.
one was the big one, right? But would we have remembered it like we do without that moment? I was in D.C. earlier this summer, and there is a marker on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial where he said those words, and you
Mm-hmm.
can go. And it's weird to take a selfie of the ground, right? But I don't know if there's a marker there
Yeah.
if he doesn't ad lib and say that. So
Yeah, it's powerful to think about that, but I think if you can apply that, Jarrod, in today's world, when you have opportunities to get on a show or deliver a talk or give a speech or talk to your team in an internal meeting or sell to a prospect, like what happens if there isn't an anchor or a reminder or someone that reminds you what you should be delivering?
I don't know. I'm checking the meat. By the way, we're gonna have a
Okay.
meat check. Okay, we got a ways to
Looks
go,
pink.
but it looks pink. Not done. They call that the salmonella special if you eat that now. So, what is what's the takeaway from that? So you're the communicator, Talia, the great communicator, right? And you teach people through your business how to communicate. If you're talking about this story, what does that mean to me?
Yeah, to you, it means that you got to go as deep as Dr. King and you have to sit with and think about and reflect on what is the thing that moves you? What is the thing that makes you so angry? That's so personal to you, a problem that you've experienced in your life. What's the problem at the core of what you're solving in your businesses? And what is that? Like, I know what it is for me. I help every single person that goes through our trainings understand what it is for them. And I think a huge shift is actually realizing that, like I said, we pick these problems out of a hat and we don't realize that what we're doing in business is an extension of us. And we have to identify like where that has come from in our own personal experiences in life, not just in business, but in our own personal life that makes us so fit and connected to the problem. And I have that answer for
I,
sure.
I think that's so interesting. Now, this is gonna be a little bit of a weird question, but communication is so central to this sort of thing
Mm.
that do you follow politics at all?
I don't really like to follow politics. I'll tell you what. I'm very like in the know of kind of what's going on, but I'm not that person that's like watching every debate or like reading every
Yeah.
article. I think that that's really energy consuming.
Well, for sure. And I've spent a lot. The last couple of years have just turned off like political stuff, and
Yeah.
man, blood pressure, you know, right? But I will say that I've always been fascinated not so much by the politics. Like, yeah, I follow politics and I have an opinion, but I also get really interested in sort of like the sport of politics and
Sure.
how people communicate and how people pick certain messaging and pick certain positioning and
Hmm.
the iconography and their logos and the positioning and
Yeah.
the view, the way things look when they're standing. Guys standing on a tractor and whatever. What message is he
Yeah.
trying to convey and who's he trying to connect with? And I think. To your point, if you think about politics, the most
Hmm.
effective politicians are able to tap into emotion. And it's certainly what Trump did. It's certainly what Obama did back in the day, tapping into hope and everything else. And I watched the Republican debates a couple of weeks ago, and I won't get into any of people's positions or whatever, but I saw a whole bunch of people that were just super robotic and
Mm,
super
yeah.
so the standard sort of way of being like, particularly like establishment politicians on
Yeah.
either
It's like
side
a
of the
talking
aisle
head.
is just like, talking
Yep.
point, talking point. Someone says, hot button issue, and you
Totally.
go party line, right? And you say
Totally.
something cute, and then you go, yeehaw or whatever. You
Yep.
try to be the ones that throw. So the Vivek Ramaswamy is a guy, and if it didn't matter what you think about his politics,
Hmm.
that guy was absolutely a 0.0 in the like collective understanding of anybody
Mm.
knowing who he was. But he uses things like what you talked about, pattern interruptions, right? So
Mm.
everybody else is giving an answer, burp, 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 and he'll kind of go, well, and next thing
Mm.
you know, people are like, I really like. Then nobody knows what that guy really stands for
Yeah.
yet. It's too
Yeah.
early, but everybody's talking about him because he's communicating in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I look at that all the time in business. I look at that all the time in business where I go to lots of events or I speak at some events and I just watch the interactions happening between people. And it's like talking head. It's very robotic and not always, but I would say most of the time. And that's something that I'm actually on a real big mission to change because I think that it's a crying shame for how much for how much effort and love and energy we put into our businesses, especially if you're somebody who leads with service and is really there for like the win-win-win versus just for your own selfish intent. But I think it's in politics. I think it's in, I mean, let's think about this for a second. It's so much in politics. Again, I think that there's no good or bad, and I'm not trying to like give a strong opinion, but the thing that does bother me a lot is like, there are very few presidents that will address a nation without reading from a teleprompter. Like, I think that that's something that that's really sad to me, because I think that it should just come from inside. It should be like the MLK moments. It should be like talking to the soul of a company or a soul of a country. And it shouldn't be something that you have to read, or at least read without emotion.
Well, I mean, if you go back, the history of the country, most presidents' best moments are either ad-libbed moments or super emotional moments. There's nothing to fear but fear itself. Ask not what you can do for your country, or what. I'm sorry, I'm butchering that.
Ask not for yourself, what you should do for your country.
Thank you. But think about like George W. Bush, who was absolutely mocked his entire presidency about his sort of yeehaw, I'm reading from a script and it doesn't feel right. But buddy, when that guy when he was in moments where he was allowed to ad lib or whatever, he was phenomenal and people loved it. Think about the time when he's standing with the firefighters in 9/11 and he's ad libbing. That guy, everybody would have done anything for that guy because he was passionate and spoke to a moment where everybody was looking to a leader. And then you put him in front of a teleprompter and people are just booing and hissing at him because it's not who he is.
No. And so if we can so clearly see that in politics, Jarrod, why the heck don't we acknowledge that in business?
It's a great question. I think if you ask someone who's in business who they admire, who's a great communicator, who they like to follow, almost all of those people that they would name when they speak are loose and have personality and sort of have a perspective. And yet everyone's afraid to be that, right?
Yeah, but I also think that they just don't know how. Because I think that there's so much direction out there of like, oh, you should talk like this, you should do that, or you should use emotion here, you should say that you should use anger. Like, the direction is not the point. Everything that we do with our trainings is to give you freaking clarity. It's like, you have to understand the psychology of how people process you to then change your approach. And I think people need way more clarity than direction as a starting point. And I also think that there's like specifically, Jarrod, we only focus on like verbal communication. I'm not writing copy. I mean, I try help when that's something that, would benefit a client, but we're not like a branding agency where we're writing all of your copy. We're literally only helping you with your verbal communication and presentation skills, because that is the skill that you'll always need. AI cannot replace unless you're truly going to use it to like be you, which again is questionable in terms of how effective it can be emotionally. I don't also want a world where that happens, but
buddy, I got a episode, 2 episodes that you should go check out. 2 episodes ago,
I'll listen to it.
That was just almost doomsday about generative AI and what it can do.
Yeah,
so
it's crazy.
I sort of tend to think of the world the way you do, which is I think that we're never going to be in a place where we can have something have emotion and have a soul and have a.
Well, it certainly can't replace you in real life. Like,
right.
And we can live and work remotely forever, but yeah, I don't know. I think that when you get on Zoom, it's going to be clear whether you're talking to like Talia or you're talking to like Talia's robot.
I hope so, right? For sure.
I hope so too.
So if you've got someone who is, let's say, an introvert. This is a question I really want. Do you when you talk to people, do you sort of try to figure out whether someone's an introvert or an extrovert before you start giving them pointers?
It's pretty clear from the beginning.
Yeah, okay.
It's pretty clear. Like, you can tell an extrovert from an introvert, but it's not the same approach. I think that at the core of what we're teaching people, it's actually how to connect to what's natural for you. Like, here's what's unnatural.
What is an introvert's approach?
An introvert's approach most often is not communicating. Like, they're not saying anything about themselves. They're just listening, and then they're, like the fly on the wall in somebody else's conversation. I think it takes a lot for an introvert to actually like open up a conversation of their own and actually lead it or talk about themselves. So I think in many ways that's a problem for them because they think they have to be an extrovert, and that's not true.
Right.
You just have to do what's more natural to you.
So an introvert is probably more likely to be a good listener, is what I'm sort of hearing you say.
Well, they're probably likely to be a more good, like a good listener. And I think that also a contributor to an existing conversation if they have the courage and develop the courage to contribute because they feel connected to what they're all about and the problem that they're solving. Again, I think it connects, like the core of it is the same. You can be an extrovert or an introvert, but without the connection to like why you and no one else and what are you doing and why are you doing it. I don't think that you can break through whatever your limitations are. But I would say introverts are most likely contributing to an existing conversation.
Do you think there's such thing as an ambivert? Because I've heard people say that, and I have a theory, but I want to hear.
I've not heard that term actually.
So it's an ambivert is somebody who is sort of like an introvert that is able to flex and be extroverted when it is necessary, and I think that is a bunch of hooey, frankly. I think I think you're either an extrovert or you're an introvert, and that really, at least in my sort of like life experience when I've dealt with people and I'm trying to like figure out what makes them tick, it's an energy thing as much as it is a communication thing. And I think just because you're an introvert does not mean you can't communicate well. It just means you don't draw energy from crowds of people in constant communication, right?
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think that it's energy in a different way. Like extroverts are loud in their energy. Like they're very like obvious,
right.
I just walked through a room type of energy. And introverts are more subtle. But I once read a book, I think it was by Stuart Wilde, and it's called Silent Power. And it's a very interesting concept that I think a lot about for introverts, where it's the way you carry silence or the way that it's the energy you project when you're being quiet that is actually really powerful.
All right, so I have a question I want to ask you, which is a new thing we're trying on the show. And so you're going to be my first person that's going to do this, but I know a little bit about your story from your bio and everything else.
Cool.
So what is if the one thing you would tell yourself as a piece of advice if you could go back in time and talk to your younger self?
It's a really great question. There was a lot going on in my younger self's life. The one piece of advice that I would give would have been to take all the pain that I was going through at the time and use it as a catalyst for something way earlier in my life. Like literally use it and recognize that there's so much you can do with it. I think it's what makes me today extremely emotive when I talk. But I probably just want to remind that younger version of myself that like it was going to become something really freaking cool one day.
To know that the pain was going to move towards something productive, or
or that the pain was going to be the inception of me wanting to create a business, multiple. It would have been the inception of like, oh, this is something I can go do something about and act on versus just like act out.
Look how powerful you are today, right? I mean, you've got all this.
Yeah, well, I think everyone goes through their own version of that, right? But I don't think that in the moment, in your younger self moment, you always you connect what it can, where your life's going to go later on. And I think if you knew that it was going to end up a little bit better if you made different decisions, I don't think that we'd suffer as much.
I think a lot of people go through that. I don't think everybody reacts to it the way that you do, right? I mean, I think you can choose whether something like that either defines you and makes you a stronger person. And it can be the reason, that you are succeeding, or it can be the excuse you tell yourself as to why you'll never be the person you want to be. Yeah,
for sure. That's probably what I would have told myself, just given the context of what was going on in our life at that time in our family. It would probably just have been like, hang in there. It's going to become some great piece of art later.
For sure. Well, Talia, if people have, I'm sure they've enjoyed this conversation. If somebody wanted to get in touch with you, work with you at Visceral, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, you know what? Right now, I'm really focused on LinkedIn. I think it's an amazing platform to just like build relationships with people. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Talia Jacqueline. And if you want to reach out on visceralco.com, it's Visceral co.com. And that's where you can learn a little bit more about our mission and what we have to change in the business world. But I really like connecting with people on LinkedIn right now. It's been a breath of fresh air.
Well, I love LinkedIn too. To me, it's the only social network that survived that had a niche, right?
Yes,
It was
I
like, if you go
agree.
back to the mid 2000s, like there was the social network for dog walkers. There was and basically Facebook groups eliminated all of that except for LinkedIn because it's so career focused. And I think,
Yeah.
it's really evolved into something that I think is useful.
Oh, I
I
love
didn't think
it.
LinkedIn was very useful 8 or 9 years ago.
If
It
you're
was just,
interacting and engaging with people on LinkedIn, it is like
yeah.
in a meaningful way versus like dropping your sales pitch into my inbox every day. Like that's what I don't love about it, but it's also
Yeah.
fun to like kindly, set boundaries. But I think that yeah, it's a really awesome place to just like have meaningful relationships with strangers.
Cool. So everybody look up Talia Jacqueline. Go find out what Visceral is all about, visceralco.com. Talia, it's such a pleasure to have you here. I'd love
Thank
to
you for
have you
having
back as
me.
we talk about communication, but we need one more check on the
Yeah, let's check
pork
on
belly
this.
burnt ends. I need you to tell all your friends in Texas
Oh, I sure will, except
what
you're in Alabama, so this is just a teaser.
this old Alabama guy is doing down here trying to talk
That's
business.
awesome.
So thank you so much for being here. Guys, if you
Yeah,
found
thank
something
you.
valuable in this conversation, which I'm sure you did, go tell all your internet friends. Go like us on Facebook, on YouTube. We're on TikTok. I think we're everywhere. We might be on Friendster still. I don't know. But go find us and like and subscribe to this podcast, and we'll see you next time on the Slow Smoke Business Podcast.